So, last week we talked about life in water and how life has evolved to work in aquatic environments. This week, we're going to be talking about terrestrial environments, so life on land. Here's a picture of a camel. What do you think of when you think of a camel? Maybe you think of the hump, right? That's pretty characteristic. This is a dromedary camel. There's Bactrian camels or camels with two humps. You probably also think of like life in the desert or oases or water storage. Camels are very good at storing water. What type of adaptations do you think a camel has that allows it to live in the terrestrial environment, that allows it to live in the desert environment, a really dry terrestrial environment? It has a lot of different adaptations, like they have really long eyelashes to keep the sand out of their eyes. They're able to store a lot of water in their fat, and so they're able to store water for a long time. They have a really cool counter-current cooling system. So one problem about living in the desert is that you get really hot, and it can get so hot that it can fry a camel's brain. It doesn't fry the brain because when they breathe in through their nose, they have a lot of veins there, and as they breathe in, that nasal epithelium dries out. So a lot of the moisture evaporates, which cools the air and also cools those veins, and then those veins run by the arteries that are going up into the brain, and so those veins are cooling off those arteries as they're going to the brain. It's a really neat little system. Countercurrent exchange happens in a lot of different animals in a lot of different ways to help keep things nice and balanced. Alright, so we're going to start off talking about terrestrial plants. So where do most of your terrestrial plants get their water, get their nutrients? Do they get it from the air? Or do they get it from the soil? They get it from the soil, yeah. And so what are they pulling up through the soil? Well, they're getting water and they're getting nutrients. Nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. What are they doing with this nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium? They're making amino acids, proteins. They are making nucleic acids, DNA, RNA. Because plants also have those things. They need those things to function. The other thing that they need is water. So how much water can the soil hold? Like, if it's raining and water's coming into the soil, you can reach a state of saturation. That's when water is being pulled out of the soil just based on gravity. And so you can see here that this soil is losing water because it is saturated, right? But then it comes to this area called field capacity. So field capacity is when gravity is no longer pulling water out. Water is staying in the soil. What is keeping the water in the soil? What's going to be the attractive effects of water? So water likes itself. It has this thing called cohesion where water wants to stick with water. If you get two drops of water and you connect them together, they will merge, right? If you've ever raced raindrops down off a windshield, like, that is because of cohesion. They want to stick together. But water also has another property called adhesion, where it wants to stick to other things too. And so the water in a field capacity situation is sticking to these soil particles and to each other, and gravity's not strong enough to pull it out. Okay? But as this water evaporates as the soil becomes more dry, you can get to this point called the wilting point. It's something like, this is like negative 0.1 megapascals, just a measurement of osmotic potential. And this would be like negative 2.5 megapascals. So at this wilting point, the plant is no longer able to pull out water from the soil, and so it wilts. Right? So we have saturation, where the soil is completely saturated and water is just dripping out of it because of gravity. You have your field capacity, where gravity is no longer taking the water, and the wilting point, where the plants don't have enough water to bring it in. Okay? There are a lot of different soil types out there. Like, you can have sandy soil, loamy soil, silty soil, clay. Does the water holding capacity change for different soil types? That answer is yes, it does. And it's all dependent on the soil particle size. So if you look here, this is your sand particle. It's really big. Now there's a couple different types of sand. Like, you can have coarse sand, like really big particles, and you got fine sand, which is a little bit smaller. But they're still a lot bigger than a silt soil. Here's your silt. And then clay is even smaller. So here you can see basically the water holding capacity of your silt soil and your clay soil. Which one holds more? It looks like the clay holds more, because it has the smaller surface area to volume ratio, and so it's able to get more water on its surface area versus the volume than you can with your silt. And so this one would have a higher yield capacity than your silt. But there's a problem. Since these particles are so small, they have the higher field capacity, but they also have higher attraction with the water. And so if we look at this, here's your soil structure and water holding ability. Sand is really crappy at holding water. It doesn't do a very good job of it. You can see that it can hold like 10% of water to your volume of sand. And about half of that is unavailable to plants. So at field capacity, only about 5% per volume of water can be held and used for plants. So sand is really bad at holding water. As you get up to your silt loam, you see it can hold a lot more water. It's holding like 25% of its volume in water that is available for plants. If you look at it overall, it's almost up to 40. But then we kind of just plateau here. And as we move from a silt to a clay, you really aren't able to hold more total water, and even you lose some of that available water. You see how this just keeps going up when this plateaus. And so your clay can hold maybe a little bit more total water than your silt, but more of that water is unavailable for plants because it is bound too tightly to that clay. And here you can see the water capacity by soil texture as we go from coarse sand up to clay, with earmost around these silty loam types of soils. Okay. So, going back to kind of like some basic biology, we talked about osmosis, how water moves from high pressure to low pressure. We talked about diffusion, how molecules move from high pressure to low pressure. Now, how does this work with plant roots? Do they ever reach an equilibrium? Do plants ever go, I have enough water, I'm not going to bring any more water in, and I've lost enough nutrients that we are now equal between the environment and the root. No, that doesn't really happen, because plants continually lose water through this process called transpiration. So they're using water and they're losing water as water vapor. If you don't believe me, just take a plastic bag and put it over a plant, and in a little bit you'll see that there's condensation on that plastic bag because the plant is transpiring. It is losing that water as water vapor. And also, plants concentrate resources down in the roots, like sugars and amino acids, and that continues that gradient that pulls the water in. It creates that potential where water wants to come into the root. Sugars and amino acids are too large to get out of the cells. They're a lot bigger than like salts and stuff. And so that water gets pulled into the root pretty much continuously as long as there is available water. As long as that concentration in the root is more concentrated than what's in the soil. And going back to kind of some like basic botany is when we're talking about your plants, you're going to have two major vessels systems, two major tube systems that are the xylem and the phloem. The xylem transports the water up to the leaves. The phloem transports the sugars that are made in the leaves via photosynthesis down to the rest of the plant and the roots. And water has cohesion, which means it wants to stick to itself, right? And so we have this theory called the cohesion tension theory. It's basically the hypothesized idea on how water gets pulled from the roots to the leaves. So just based on the root's ability to bring in water, which would push water up to the top of the plant, plants can get about 20 meters or so tall. Like your tallest tree would be like 20 meters. But there are a lot of trees taller than 20 meters. And so how do you explain that? That's where this tension theory comes in. So as transpiration, as water is leaving the leaves, it's basically acting like a big old straw. And as the water gets pulled out, it pulls more water up. And so it creates this potential as it evaporates, and it ends up sucking water even higher into the plant, which is a really cool thing. And so down here you can see the water is coming in through the roots, traveling up the xylem that's typically found in the center of the plant, and out to the leaves. It's distributed via the veins, and then you have these stomata, these openings that your water vapor can diffuse out of via transpiration. Most of the leaves that you find in plants are going to be kind of waxy. They have this waxy cuticle on the outside of the leaves, and then if you look underneath, you might find stomata. These stomata are just little pores in the plant with guard cells around either side. These guard cells open up, and when they open up, they let carbon dioxide into the plant. And we know carbon dioxide is used for photosynthesis, right? And so these stomata are letting the carbon dioxide in, and at the same time, they're letting the water vapor out. And so we're able to bring in more water that we are not, like, as we use it up, and more carbon dioxide so we can make our carbohydrates, make our sugars. When the plant starts to wilt, a cool thing happens is these guard cells close up. So as the water is removed from them, they end up closing up. And so that stops the transpiration. That stops them losing more water. The problem is, it also stops them from bringing in carbon dioxide. So how do they counteract that? There's a couple ways, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. But before that, let's pause and think. What is the relationship between soil particle size and field capacity? So the bigger the particle, the lower the field capacity, and so you could say it's an inverse relationship. Why do you think the intermediate particle size has the highest available water? We talked about that. And then how could you test that root pressure is not sufficient to explain the movement of water in trees? Like, just think about this. What type of experiment could you set up to test if root pressure could explain all the movement of water in a tree? What kind of experiment could you set up to do that? We'll pick up with photosynthesis on the next one.